If there's one thing that even the most hardcore modern drag racing fans don't understand, it's that this sport is way, way different than it was during its formative decades in the 1950s, 60s, and yes, even into the 70s. I'm not just talking about the cars or the trucks, I'm talking about the nuts and bolts of drag racing. The classes, how the events worked, the basic rules of competition, even how winners were determined. In this video, I'm basically going to stuff us all into a time machine and head back to an era that very few of us saw in person, but even fewer of us know how it actually worked. If you think drag racing was always just a sport of 2 cars or occasionally 4 running down a track to determine a winner, you are wrong. If you think the sport has always been about showing up, qualifying, and racing for a win, you are wrong. Heck, if you think it was even about having to drive your car to the finish line, you're also wrong. Some of you may know all this stuff, but I guarantee it's a group of people small enough to fit inside an elevator. For the rest of us, yes, me included, this is a deep dive into the history of the sport of drag racing that will take us through a lot of different and interesting historical twists on how the races were run, on how the races were won, and why your eyes are often lying to you when you watch historical video or see historical drag racing photos. The amount of stuff I learned in the weeks of research to make this video blew me away. And so I hope it has the same effect on you as you watch. Now, all that being said, understand that I'm going to bounce around a little historically here, but to tell this story requires some trips through time, forward, and back. I'll make clear when I'm doing that. Also, I'm going to stick around with mostly NHRA historical factoids here. If you're wondering why, it's basically because they're the largest and most documented and understood program in drag racing. Don't worry, I'll dive off on some tangents, but know that after 1958, the whole sport was basically following NHRA's lead on many operational elements. Exceptions will be noted. Now, let's go back in time, and first we'll start with the cars. There are more than a few people who will tell you that the NHRA didn't have a rulebook in existence before the late 1950s. Well, this document right here from 1953 kind of busts that myth, and it also gets us to our first point about the early days of organized drag racing. There were basically a handful of classes, each carrying 3 subclasses as a place to race in. The 10 base classes were all variations on a few simple concepts: stock cars, sports cars, roadsters, coupes and sedans, as well as purpose-built dragsters. The stockers were just that, cars that were very, very lightly modified from the way they were delivered. Mechanically stock cars were just that, restricted in virtually every way but a scant few, and the classes were designed to show off the best that Detroit had to offer in a multitude of ways. The same concept fell into the sports car ranks as well. At this time in the 50s, it was seen as unfair to race the tank-like Detroit offerings against the smaller, lighter, and more lithe sports cars. Either way, not a ton was available for legal modification in either class. Now, these cars were divided into classes based on their weight, divided by the advertised brake horsepower of the manufactured car. They would be the only 2 classes set up like this as we go through the list. The next step up the ladder were the gas coupe and sedan classes. Now, these are streetable hot rod coupes and sedans that burned gasoline and were not largely altered in their stock body shape or material. The cars in these classes needed to have stock fenders, hood, and grille, and they could be chopped and channeled for a total of 6 inches. So you could chop the roof 4 inches and channel it 2, chop it 3, channel it 3. Any combination of 6 inches total was legal. The engine type was open to the driver, but the fuel had to be pump gasoline as bought at a local service station. These are the cars that famously became known as gassers as time went on. And as time went on, the rules got looser and looser regarding street equipment. But when these classes started, it was intended, and they were intended, for road-going hot rods. Moving along, you had the modified coupe and sedan classes. Any fuel was allowed, and the coupe or sedan body had to be present, but it could be chopped and channeled drastically. Also, there was streamlining allowed from the cowl of stock body forward. The car had to remain stock in length, but fenders fore and aft were prohibited, and many of these things look pretty weird. Cars in this division were separated out in 3 different weight per cubic inch subclasses: A, B, and C. C being the heaviest and least powerful. By far the most popular kind of car to take drag racing across the country in the 1950s was a roadster. The birth of the sport and its associated media in the 50s had made the roadster the quintessential hot rod, and it spoke to the young people around the nation as the epitome of cool. That said, it makes sense that this 1953 rules manual had more to say about roadsters in different forms than any other car. The starting roadster class was called street roadster, and these cars required pump gas for fuel, a stock body, full interior, and all street equipment like lights and other accoutrements. For the vast majority of first-time drag racers in the 1950s, street roadster was the entry point. Some of the greatest names in the sport began with humble street roadster beginnings before advancing on. The next class up was the roadster division. Any fuel was okay to use, the body had to be stock, and the grill shell had to be in the stock location and be the stock size. After that, the engine could be moved a maximum of 14 inches rearward. A 2-speed transmission was the maximum allowed here. Now, these were purpose-built race cars built by guys on a budget in the 1950s. As good as these cars were, the next step was even faster. Later on, as the sport evolved and people wanted to have a little more buzz attached, the class was renamed Hot Roadster. As an aside, most people believe the term hot rod originated from the portmanteau of the words hot roadster. This was a term that had been used during World War II and previous. Whether it came from there or not, the term hot roadster and hot rod had existed long before the sport of drag racing was invented. Next up the scale was the modified roadster category, and this was when things got really serious. Yes, there had to be a roadster body present in the construction of the car, but any fuel could be used, the engine could be placed anywhere, and streamlining was allowed throughout. No transmission was required, the body could be gutted, and as far as full-bodied cars went, this was as hardcore as it got until you moved to the dragster category. It should be mentioned that the majority of modified roadsters would be built with the engines behind the driver, and yes, this is back in the 1950s. The most gnarly and wide-open class in drag racing's earliest days, the dragsters were the show. These things were hell on wheels, and like the other classes, they were 3 weight to cubic inch breakdowns, A, B, and C. The actual rules? Virtually none. Any fuel and some type of body had to close in the cockpit. Other than that, literally have at it. And honestly, by modern standards, dragsters of the 1950s are fast cars. We're talking about machines that would run in the mid 10-second bracket and lower. If you've ever made a 10-second run in a full-bodied modern car, you know how thrilling that is. Imagine doing the same thing on what is basically an unsuspended tractor chassis with a roll bar and a pair of bare frame rails to hold the whole thing together. Pretty incredible. So that's a quick look at the earliest drag racing classes to set the stage for the really mind-blowing stuff to come. We're talking about things like how these races were run, the rules that were used, and how effectively nothing was as we know it is to be today. Also, there's tons of myth-busting ahead, so tighten your belts. We now go to 1949. Walt Warren, the editor of Motor Trend, Wally Parks, the then editor of Hot Rod, Otto Crocker, the timer for the Bonneville Salt Flats, and the man now instrumental in the early days of drag strip timing, as well as Bosie Willis and Jim Lindsay of the SCTA, got together and set up a quarter-mile acceleration course to run the then-new 1949 Lincoln through for a magazine story. Word got around, and Fred Davies, a local Oldsmobile dealer, showed up with a brand-new Olds 88, and it was game on. By the end of the day, Wally Parks reports in his book that a dozen or so cars are running down the course, sometimes side by side. In many ways, he reports, this was, quote, the forerunner of fully timed 2-car drag racing events. Now, Wally is not claiming to have invented the sport on that day, but he is claiming to have witnessed something that was very interesting. The enthusiasm the people had to run down the quarter mile, not only to see how quick they could go, to see if they could go quicker than somebody else. Now that we've spent time talking about the cars, what about the era before classes existed? How did this whole thing even work? Well, basically, it was chaos. The earliest organized drag races not only didn't have classes, they didn't have much of a defined format either. For instance, in 1950 at Santa Ana, California, which is now recognized as the first commercially operated drag strip in the world, as a clarification, that doesn't mean it's the first place people drag raced, but it is the first strip to operate as a business. The early meets were tried with side-by-side rolling starts, 3, 4, and 5 wide rolling starts, multi-car standing starts, and finally side-by-side standing starts. The standing starts were originally feared because of the breakage that came from drivers dumping the clutch on the starting line and their relatively weakling nature of the parts back then. Technique time and hot rodding overcame those problems. At more informal meets, competitors would gather in the morning to establish the quote-unquote ground rules of that day's event. How many restarts did you get if you jumped the flag? What would be the course length? Would it be single runs? Would it be side-by-side runs? Would it be 4 wide runs? All those things were determined at a driver's meeting before the day began. Interestingly, there were some early tracks that didn't run side-by-side at all. Single runs, one after the next, top speed being the determining factor as to who won that day in their particular class. And this brings us to our first 2 interesting observations. The first is the fact that drag racing has not always been a sport about elapsed time. Because the sport began in earnest on the West Coast with dry lakes racers transitioning onto concrete and asphalt runways, top speed was the number everyone was chasing. This makes sense for the fact that top speed was the number everyone was always chasing out there in the dry lakes and on the Bonneville Salt Flats. This was such an important factor that most Western strips did not use or care to have elapsed time clocks for the first several years of organized drag racing. On the East Coast, though, there was no tradition of land speed racing, and as the races were viewed as sprints, having the lowest elapsed time was prioritized against having the highest top speed. As time would go on, elapsed time would overtake speed in raw importance when it came to the winning and losing of drag races, but out west, speed was king until the middle 1950s. This is also an era where finish line judges would be employed at strips that lacked timing equipment and were simply running cars heads up to a finish line. This practice sometimes still is used in street racing today. Now, how those speeds were calculated back in the day is a story in and unto itself. Now, let's talk more about speed, its importance, and how speeds were actually calculated at drag strips back in the 1950s and early 1960s. As the race was started by a flagman, the actual timer was a 132-foot timing trap, which, when properly laid out, started 66 feet before the quarter-mile finish line and finished 66 feet after it. Whether it was a system by Krondek, Fosdick, or any other early timing system company, workers in the timing tower would be provided a chart that converted the speed through the trap itself, as measured in thousandths of a second, into a speed number. Here you can actually see one of the charts that was used back in the day. Now, this was an accurate system to a point, but in an instance like Chris Karamessinis and his controversial 204-mile-an-hour run at Alton, Illinois in 1960, the speed calculation there was an extrapolation of his time through the timing trap. Complicating this was the fact that there was no actual printed conversion of that number because no one had ever gone that fast. Was it an accurate mathematical extrapolation? We'll never truly know. It's one of the most hidden parts of the story that few people understand from the most controversial run in drag racing history. As a reminder, there was no screen that popped up and said 204 miles an hour, nor was there a paper chart that had actually mathed that out because it had never happened, and it seemed too fanciful a speed to be even achieved in that era. In the end, that 204-mile-an-hour speed was a mathematically aided, scientific estimate. Some people believe it, some people don't, and I'll leave that decision up to you. Another interesting factor is that in this era of drag racing, to the winner went the time slip. There's a really good reason that some tracks preferred to run their entire race as a collection of single runs, and when it was created, to run qualifying session as single runs. And that's only because dual lane timing didn't exist in the early days of drag racing. Back then, the first car across the finish line would receive the time slip. The second car, that driver basically got to speculate how fast or slow they were, judging off how much they were beaten by the faster car on the other side of the racetrack. Now it becomes clear why when watching old footage from this era, you see many single runs made for either qualifying purposes or for record attempts. You cannot accurately qualify cars and only one slip will be given, nor can you have accurate record runs for the same reason. Unless you think this was a situation with only small tracks back then. In fact, it went to the highest levels of the sport. Here's an example. In the final round of the 1955 NHRA Nationals, Calvin Rice beat Fritz Voigt for the top eliminator title by running 10:30. What did Fritz Voigt run? We'll never know, other than for the fact it wasn't quick enough. Runner-up results simply do not exist outside of the guy's name from this era in drag racing. Oh, while we're talking about stuff that was vastly different back then than it is now, let's talk about the starting line. Before the advent of the Christmas tree, drag races were famously started with a flagman. These guys were high-flying jumpers that not only started the race with flair, but they'd also decide if the races were fairly started or not. Effectively, the flagman got to quote-unquote wave off a start he didn't like, especially if he thought somebody jumped early. The final round of the 1955 Nationals between Rice and Voigt was started not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times, and it gets even better than that. Fritz Voigt jumped the flagman twice in a row. A 3rd time would have been a disqualification, and yes, you got 3 tries. Imagine if you got 3 tries at red lighting today. In the 3rd attempt, Rice jumped and in the process blew up the transmission of his car violently enough that pieces had to be physically removed from the track. Officials sent Rice back to the pit area to repair his car, and a half hour later the race was started a 4th time with Rice beating Voigt, receiving the time slip and the eternal glory of being the top eliminator champion at the first NHRA national event ever held. As I told you at the start, I'm going to jump around in the eras a little bit to tell different aspects of this story. So staying with the starting line, we should next talk about the addition of the Christmas tree to drag racing in 1963 by the NHRA. But before that, burnouts. Over the course of the first 15 years of the sport's existence, races moved along with an exceptional clip. The traffic was nearly unending going down the racetrack. The reason being, there were no burnouts. 2 cars would run, 2 cars would be running behind them, they would roll up stage and run, and so on and so forth. This was until the Hot Rod Magazine Championships in 1969 at Riverside in California, where Don Garlits is credited as creating the burnout as a procedural part of every run. At that race, there was a very long lead-up to the starting line. Garlits had witnessed other racers, mainly Steve Carbone, stopping and scrubbing their tires before rolling up to stage. He figured he might try it as well. And this didn't interrupt the cadence of the race because he was simply rolling up to the starting line and not over it. He grabbed the brake, stomped the gas, smoked his tires briefly, pulled up and staged, and the car went quicker. After that happened, he decided to do a burnout before every single run. Now, unlike Riverside, most tracks didn't have that much room, so the cadence of the race completely changed. He would tell his opponent that he was going to do a burnout, and they could start later than him as to not get too hot. Garlits would come off the push truck, roll up through the water, which was then bleach, smash the gas, smoked the tires across the starting line, and because of a lack of a reverser in that era, his crew would pull him back to the starting line. It wasn't long before everybody started doing this, and the showmanship of burnouts became a big part of the sport. What it also did was start to slow the races down. The cars did pick up performance, the fans did love the theater, but the pace of running a drag race was slowed down forever. And now, back to the Christmas tree. In previous videos, I talked about the device and mentioned that the racers hated it, which was not hyperbole. They really and truly did. The professional racers of the day called it the anticipation start system, and many said it allowed slower cars to put a whole shot on faster ones, and it really did annoy the seasoned racers out there who had adapted their style to running either with an instant green or with the flagman. The drivers railed against the Christmas tree in magazines and anywhere people would listen. But why did they really hate it? And the reason is not what you're thinking, and when I explain it, or better yet show you, you'll definitely understand. But before we do that, we have to take another sidetrack. All the way deep into the 1970s, modern drag racing fans would get lost in trying to follow the normal operation of a national event. The procedures and race coordination were 100% alien to how it's done today. For starters, qualifying. Up until about 40 years ago, NHRA didn't have qualifying quote-unquote sessions. The lanes would open when the gates open in the morning, and designated classes would have designated lanes. Competitors could get as many runs as possible over the course of a long day to try to qualify for their respective field, and there was very little order to the process. Meaning, the fans could watch 4 to 5 pairs of superstock cars, followed by 4 to 5 pairs of top fuel dragsters, followed by 4 to 5 pairs of modified eliminator cars, followed by 4 to 5 pairs of funny cars, and so on and so forth all day long. The reason the stands are largely packed in old drag strip photos when cars like stock eliminator machines are running is not because the world loved stock eliminator so much more then than they do now, but it's because they knew the nitro cars were coming or would be shortly. At least they hope so. The NHRA in the later 1960s began to concentrate their professional level qualifying in the evenings, allowing fans to know that if they showed up in the afternoon, they'd see the heavy hitters later in the day. But just to be clear, there was no time schedule like is employed now. Also, the standing rule was that any car started and running at the proposed end of qualifying could make a run. This means that if 5 p.m. was the cutoff time, there would be loads of race cars all running and idling, including nitro burners, desperate for their last attempt to make the show before the fields were locked. Now comes the part that would confuse the daylights out of modern fans. In the earliest era of this qualifying process, the competitors were basically trying to lock their cars into their respective class elimination fields. During national events at this time, there were effectively 2 races that happened. Saturday would be reserved for class eliminations, which is as simple as it sounds. Every car in, say, the O-Stock automatic class all the way up to the AA fuel dragster class would race within their specific category to determine a class winner. It would be AA fuel dragster versus AA fuel dragster all day, A-Stock automatic versus A-Stock automatic all day, and so on for every single class until every class was run down to its quickest and fastest car. Now, at an event like the U.S. Nationals, there would be dozens and dozens of class winners. Now, this can be a confusion to modern fans and even historically sound fans as well. For instance, in 1963, in the Wide World of Sports broadcast, Don Garlits was interviewed as the dragster champion. He had won the AA dragster class, but would actually lose the event title the next day when he red-lit in the final round for top eliminator honors. If it doesn't make any sense, just stay with me. This structure had been in place since the NHRA drag safari races and was used at the 1955 Nationals and forward. Top eliminator was given to the overall winner of the event, with Calvin Rice and his nitro-burning dragster beating Fritz Voigt's gasoline-burning dragster in the finals at 55 Great Bend. As it became very clear that dragsters, whether gasoline-burning or nitro-powered, would typically find themselves in the top eliminator runoffs, Wally Parks and the NHRA added middle eliminator and little eliminator to allow various different types and classes and categories to compete for an event victory. Today, every single class at an NHRA national event races for an overall event win. But back then, pay attention, because I'm about to explain it, and it's kind of weird. If the NHRA had all these class winners on Saturday, what did they do with them on Sunday? Sunday was the time for the event eliminator categories. Going into the 1966 NHRA rulebook, there were 7 of them, and the top 2 are very easy to define. Top fuel was AA fuel dragsters running off against each other. Top gas was AA gas dragsters running off against each other. So we've established that these 2 classes use the same 2 categories to run off against each other. Seems simple enough, right? Even this one has a twist. If there were 40 AA fuel dragsters or 40 AA gas dragsters competing for their respective class eliminations, the 17 quickest cars in each class were qualified to run in the event eliminator on Sunday. But why 17? That is because of the sit-out rule. The winner in AA Fuel Dragster and AA Gas Dragster class eliminations on Saturday got to literally sit around all day Sunday while their fellow 16 competitors beat the brakes off each other. And then, once there was a single car left, the previous day's winner had a free pass into that final to race for the top fuel or top gas title respectively. Wild, right? The idea of running for a single top eliminator crown was gone by this time, as the fuel dragsters were vastly outpacing the gas dragsters, and running them heads up really wasn't worth anybody's time anymore. Okay, so with that established, those were the only 2 heads-up eliminator classes contested on Sunday. The other 5 eliminators? Let's go through them. Super Eliminator was a category for supercharged entries. So on Sunday, this class was made up of the class winners from the Double B Fuel Dragster, Double C Fuel Dragster, Double B Dragster, Double C Dragster, Double A Competition, Double A Altered, Double B Altered, Double A Gas, Double B Gas, Double C Gas, Double A Street Roadster, and Double A Modified Sports Production categories. Competition Eliminator was made up of the class winners from A Fuel, B Fuel, C Fuel, D Fuel, A, B, and C Dragster, as well as D Dragster, A and B Comp, A, B, C, and D Altered. The Street Eliminator category was the class winners from A through H Gas, A through CFX, A through F Modified Production, D Sports Production, and D Modified Sports Production, categories A through D. The Top Stock category were the winners from Super Stock Automatic, A Stock, and A Stock Automatic, along with the 7 quickest elapse time qualifiers in each of the 4 categories to make up a 32-car field. Finally, Junior Stock was made of the class winners from B Stock through O Stock, as well as B Stock Automatic through J Stock Automatic. Now, if that's confusing, just remember one thing. The only way you got to race on Sunday at a national event back then was to win your class on Saturday. So Sunday was almost an all-star race, with the quickest and fastest of every category squaring off in one of their 7 eliminator classes. Here's where we get back to the high-level professionals hating the Christmas tree, and why they hated it will become crystal clear when you understand how eliminations worked using the tree and when not using the tree. The 5 classes behind AA Fuel Dragster and AA Gas Dragster were all handicap start style racing. Prior to the Christmas tree, this was done via car lengths. The practice was developed in horse racing and translated in a seemingly smooth fashion to drag racing. As it took years for every track and organization to accept the tree, we're going to look at runs from the 1965 AHRA Winter Nationals to see this system in action, and it's pretty hilarious. The physical spread between the cars varies from the mundane to the absolutely ridiculous. Note the fact that at times the starter is hundreds of feet down the course and has to stand there, wave the flag, and run for his life. Note the fact that the slower cars just get torn to shreds by the faster cars, and now you can understand why the pro racers with the fast cars didn't want this style of competition to go away. When you watch all of these bizarrely spread pairs, you can understand that the fast cars leaving from a standing start and a sluggish slow car leaving from a standing start down course, the fast car has a massive advantage. It seems wild, right? These runs were not being done as a one-off in this video from the 1965 AHRA Winter Nationals. This is how the sport worked at all but a tiny handful of strips that had adopted the tree, and the scant few NHRA national events where it was used as the standard operating procedure. You will note, at this AHRA national event held at Beeline Dragway, they used an instant green style quote-unquote tree. A yellow light to indicate stage and a green light to indicate go. There's also a flagman. Why was the flagman necessary? When you have a car that's 400 feet down the racetrack, he can't see the tree anymore. The real root cause of the tree's hatred by the sports stars was the electronic handicapping system. The stars of the sport were no longer trying to make up simple car lengths against a much slower opponent that was simply placed at half track and would be lumbering off his starting mark like a school bus. Now we had to let that guy leave and get a running head start on him. And God forbid that guy in the lumbering car that was going to run 5 to 6 seconds out before he could leave without red lighting hit the tree better than he did. The rock star racer could be in real trouble if he didn't leave on time. Now, these cars were handicapped off of their own respective class national records, so if a guy in a low-class stalker was as good as his national record, and the guy in the top shelf A stalker was slow off the line, he'd run out of drag strip before he could catch the slow car. The same handicapping system was used for other classes, and it made for amazing side-by-side moments. This was especially true in Super Eliminator, which was likely the most entertaining and awesome handicap drag racing category that ever existed. When examples like this of an injected nitro-burning Mustang from Tasca Ford trying to hang with the mighty Winged Express AA Fuel Altered, that's Super Eliminator, because in 1967 the NHRA allowed AA and A funny cars into the class. And that, my friends, is a show. If you can imagine it, fans loved the handicap racing back in the day off of the Christmas tree. It made for a far more entertaining show than watching two cars spread way out. The modern version of Competition Eliminator in the NHRA is the last vestige of this era. Like the 1960s, it's a handicap start with no breakout at the finish line. The first car to cross the line gets a win. Every other handicap class has a breakout component to prevent racers from sandbagging by disqualifying them if they run under their predicted elapsed time handicap. So back then, when the day was done on Sunday, there would be 7 NHRA national event winners, one from each of the classes described above. This part can be very confusing to people reading old drag racing coverage or news. Class winners and eliminator winners were two totally different things. Class racing does still occur at national events in stock and superstock, and it's still as fun to watch now as it was then. Let's talk about some of the weirder and more interesting rules of drag racing's early days. Runs had to be finished by any means necessary, and that meant guys pushing their broken cars to the finish line, sometimes by themselves, and on a few notable occasions, both drivers would be engaged in a quarter-mile foot race pushing their cars to the finish line. In at least one instance, both men ended up in the hospital, and this practice, while largely uncommon, was in place through the 1960s before being eliminated a lot later than you would have expected it to be. Everyone and everything had to leave at night. There's a great and romantic image from these early days of drag racing, and it's that picture of guys working on their cars in a hotel parking lot at night during an event. There's a real simple reason for this. Everybody had to leave. Not a car or a person stayed inside the track at a national event for many years. Why were they working at the hotel? Where else were they supposed to go? Jim Tice of the AHRA was one of the great show promoters in drag racing history. He wanted his fans having left the event knowing who won on the professional high-profile level, and he wanted to see them do it in dramatic fashion. This meant that no one was going to win an AHRA national event on a single, but how did he ensure that? There would typically be 3 cars running on the starting line for a nitro-burning final round. The 2 semifinal winners and the quick loser of the semis. The quick loser was effectively in an alternate position, and if one of the 2 cars broke or had an issue before staging, that car could jump right into the mix and run for the win. If a car broke on the burnout, that guy's in. If a competitor's car wouldn't fire, that guy's in. If one was leaking, that guy jumps in. Believe it or not, it happened more than once, and it was a showman's stroke of genius for Tice. A dramatic end to a dramatic day at the drags. And now I have one last grand Mythbuster for you as a bonus for those of you that stuck around this long. Nitro was still expensive as heck back in the 1950s and 60s. Some historical research shows very quickly that nitromethane has never, ever been cheap. This stuff was selling for $3 a gallon 60 years ago. That's the equivalent of more than $30 a gallon today. Modern nitro racers are paying about $30 a gallon for the stuff today. Back then, it was easier to access, but with one company in the country producing it, the Illinois-based Commercial Solvents Corporation, it was still a precious commodity. The one thing the 50s and 60s racers had going for them beyond the racers of today, they didn't use near as much of it per run as the cars in modern drag racing do. I hope you enjoyed this long trip back into the weird and wild world of early drag racing. It was the Wild West in so many ways and helped to form the sport we know and love today. It's true that so many modern drag racing fans would be 100% lost and adrift if placed in the stands at one of these old races. From the weird qualifying, the single-lane timing, the difference between class eliminations, and even eliminators, the sit-out rule, having to leave every day and more, this really was a formative time in the sport. As always, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more historical, automotive, and racing content.